Um, Thank you for coming, especially for the last session of the day at 4:30 p.m. I'm going to be talking about open sourcing your enterprise. I've been involved with the open source effort at Goldman Sachs for a long time, for at least 6-7 years now. And during that time, we've taken an enterprise that was essentially friendly to consumption, and we've moved that forward to a place where we're not only friendly to consumption, but we're also very friendly to contribution and ownership. And today, what I want to do for you is walk you through why that's actually good for the organization, and then give you the recipes we've honed over the years that have been successful for us, that you may be able to implement in your organizations to be able to do the same thing. And at the end, I'll give you a set of questions you have to ask yourself to see how far you've gone along the openness scale. How successful have you been in making your enterprise open source friendly? So I always like to start with saying that there's 3 things you can do with open source. You can consume open source, you can contribute to open source, and you can own open source. And it's perfectly all right if you start on the consumption end, because a lot of the value proposition comes from that. But don't mistake the fact that not contributing and not owning don't fully give you the benefits of open source, and that's what you have to really realize to push those efforts forward. You've heard about the benefits of open source all day long today, so I'm trying not to harp too much on these, but I'll try to point out the bits where contributing and owning make a big difference for you. So when it comes to reducing costs, there's the obvious, okay, somebody else wrote this code, I can use it. That's nice. But what happens if somebody else wrote a piece of code and they had 95% of what you needed and you needed 5% more? If you can't contribute, then you have a problem, because you either end up writing all of it, or you end up taking that code inside and forking it, which is also costly. So one of the benefits of contributing would be that you can actually do that 5% extra and get where you want to be. There's one other aspect that we've probably not heard too much about today, which is the legal cost of consuming open source. If you have a program where you know what licenses you like and what licenses you don't like, it's actually really easy to consume open source. I've been in contract negotiations with software vendors where the legal team and some other teams at the firm had to go through every word of the contract and negotiate that back with the vendor because there were things we didn't agree on. And that's a very costly, time-consuming process. That is one process you don't have to do if you're happy with taking an open source license. Of course, there's a benefit of higher quality code. This also is important when it comes to ownership and contribution, because if you put your own code out there, you get the same benefits because other people are going to be looking at your code that potentially wouldn't have been doing it. So this is not just code you're consuming that's higher quality, but your own code that you put out there is higher quality. Every time I interview a new potential employee, it's amazing how excited they get when I tell them we have this great program at Goldman Sachs where you can write code and contribute it to open source. The shift has been dramatic in the last 10 years. Every student coming out of a university has a GitHub account now, and they expect to be able to do this. And if they go to a firm where that is not a possibility, it's not as good a story for them. So that's a big draw for having open source as something that people can do as part of their regular work. When I'm writing a piece of code and I try to understand what does this particular piece of code do, it's also really important for me to be able to look at the source for that, because that is the ultimate answer to what does this code do. If I had to just look at documentation, that, for example, you would get with vendor software, I'd have to rely on the fact that the documentation is up to date and correct. And my parsing of the English language in that documentation is exactly what the developer meant, which is not necessarily, the same translation that everybody has in their head. But if I can go into that piece of code and put a breakpoint in it and understand how it works, that really empowers me as a developer to interact with that piece of code. And that's something that is a huge benefit of using open source. Finally, by contributing and owning open source, you can have a seat at the table. You can be in organizations where new things are coming out and be able to voice your concerns because you're a respected member of the community because of your track record. There are, of course, risks associated to using anything. The things you have to worry about are licensing compatibility and potential litigation. The litigation aspect is actually quite interesting. What we've found is litigation happens whether you're using open source or not. And it's essentially a constant tax on the ecosystem. Obviously, you have to have good code review to prevent things like malicious code contribution. And as we've heard many, many times today, you have to worry about the security and vulnerability of any piece of code you use, whether it's vendor software or open source. Finally, you have to worry about a bit of culture clash. Sometimes you may be in a big organization where the culture says you can only use the software if you have a support contract, right? And that can be a big hurdle for people using open source because most open source out there is not something that you find is backed by a commercial entity that gives you a support contract. So you have to get through those culture differences because that'll get you to a place where you can use this stuff much more readily. And then there's the old stuff. I used to hear this stuff more back 10, 15 years ago where people would say, oh, open source is not as good a quality as commercial software, or well, we're using product X and everything has to be certified to use with product X. Thankfully, those kinds of culture clashes have become less and less over time. Looking further at motivation, if you ask people, do you want to be in a place where your employees are contributing to open source? Their answer is always yes, but they're not always in a place where that's possible. So if you look at the portion of the people who are actually contributing, that portion is actually going up. And if you look at the numbers, they went from 50 to 63 to 65 from 2014 to 2016. And the 2017 numbers came up and it was like 66%. So it seems to be trailing off somewhat, right? So Facebook asked their employees, were you aware of the open source software program at Facebook? And the ones that answered, some of them said yes, and that was one of the reasons I came to work for Facebook. So that sort of notion that you can retain and get better developers is born from actual observation of bigger companies. And again, if you ask companies out there, do you want to make it easier for people to contribute? The answer is almost always yes. OK, so now we get to the part where I'm going to tell you some of the recipes we use to make this stuff easier. So I'm going to give you a consumption recipe, I'm going to give you a contribution recipe, and I'm going to give you an ownership recipe. One of the most important things in all of this is that you have to have air support. And what do I mean by that? I mean, at the highest levels of the organization, people have to be supportive of what you're doing. So that is one of your first tasks. Sell the benefits so that you get support from the highest levels, and that'll allow you to push this forward. From a consumption perspective, you definitely need to have a license policy in place. And to make the consumption really frictionless, you have to have an automated check here that there shouldn't be people sitting in the middle to do these checks to allow your organization to rapidly use any kind of open source they need that is policy compliant. So on that particular notion, what you should do is you should mirror and filter well-known repositories like Maven and NPM and NuGet and so on and so forth inside your organization where the filtering happens based on your policy automatically. You'll always find that things that are not in Maven or NPM and so on and so forth, so you will need to also have an automated way of getting the other parts of open source into the firm. It doesn't have to be nearly as automated because they tend, most of the software can today come through repositories, but you still have to have that in place. And it really makes sense to think about paid support for this type of consumption that is automated on a large scale. Finally, one thing that makes a big difference in the comfort level of the organization is if you can put processes in place that do post-use compliance. So for example, can you add a piece of software into your build system that says, OK, in this particular build, these 12 libraries were used, and these are the licenses that were used, and then we can record that somewhere and be happy that we've seen that, right? To understand contribution and ownership, I really like to break this down into 3 different aspects, which is the legal aspect, the social aspect, and the technical aspect. And it's funny because understanding these at the level where you can be a good contributor makes it possible for you to also be a good consumer. So if you're just thinking about consumption, these are still things you should think about. All right, so the contribution recipe. Again, the number one thing is sell the benefits. Make sure you have air support, right? The highest people in the organization should be behind you when you try to do this. The second thing you have to think about is you want to make this thing fast and efficient. And to do that, you should really tease out the different aspects of it so that the final part, which is writing code, can be done quickly. And the way we did that is we said, OK, instead of saying that I'm going to do this contribution, it has to go this huge workflow, and I'm going to do a second contribution that has to go through this huge workflow, why don't we find places in this workflow that we can reduce to a one-time activity? And once we've done that, the final workflow for producing code is much smaller. And to do that, we established training for people. So now people get trained once. We established a registry of people and projects. So now projects get vetted only once. And finally, we established a way for code to get reviewed really quickly. Because we said, when we do the code review to push something out, what is really important is the IP here. So the code review is going to be just about IP. We expect the open source ecosystem itself to do everything else open source systems do, which is take care of quality, take care of security, and take care of all this other stuff that's important. But that should happen in the open at the project level. It shouldn't be something that I should be concerned with from a perspective of pushing my code out. So by reducing these steps to the essentials, we were able to make that particular recipe really efficient because we did things once for particular things that required it just once. And the things that happen all the time, like writing code, can be done very quickly. And finally, it's important that you support both people writing code on their own devices and people writing code on your machines at work. Because that's actually kind of a litmus test to say, are you really open? Are you doing this in a way that is actually open? All right, from a legal perspective, you do have to review your employment agreements and the copyright law. And the funny thing about copyright law is that it's actually different in different jurisdictions. So you have to talk to the lawyers in all places where you do business. You then have to explain these rules to your employees because they don't always understand what it is they signed when they started working for you. Finally, there is a bit of misunderstanding generally around open source, which is open source licenses are really about consuming open source. But there's also another legal aspect, which is what are the set of rules that you have to follow to contribute? And those two things are not always the same thing. There's roughly 4 legal frameworks for contribution, which is copyright assignment, which happens still but not as popular. Contribution agreements, which are very popular today, and you see them with Apache and Google and a whole bunch of other places. In equals out, where this is sort of the most equitable one, where the license of the consumption is also the license for contribution, so in equals out. And then finally, in equals out with a developer certificate of origin. All right, so the social aspect we talked about earlier. There are some important social pillars of open source, and the reason we put this up front and center is because you have to organize yourself and your programs in a way that respects these particular sets of social attributes. So collaboration and open exchange are a really important part of open source. You can't do open source where you tell your developers, well, you can't talk to anybody about this stuff. That's not open. Meritocracy. You have to be in a place where if you have committers on a project because they're experts on that particular project, they don't necessarily have to be your employees. People not inside your organization can be experts in particular things, and you have to be open to that idea. Transparency, freedom to tinker. These are all important things you have to think about. For example, if you're writing code inside your firm and dumping it out every now and then, that's not transparent, right? These are the types of things you have to think through to make sure you're doing openness correctly. And several other things, including good citizenship, which gets me to my last point, which is you got to respect the local rules. Every project out on the internet has a set of rules, potentially, that you have to understand to be able to contribute to them properly, right? And they're not always the same rules. So make sure you understand what their local rules are, and you make sure your developers understand that they have to follow those particular local rules. All right, as part of the contribution recipe, this is actually the mechanical way in which we do our contribution today. The way this works is normally all you do on GitHub is you fork a project, then you clone that project, you write some code, you push that to GitHub, and you ask for a pull request. What we've done, I know there's a lot of boxes on here, but what we've really done, we've added just one extra step in there, which is that internal fork. By creating that internal fork, what we can do is we can ask our developers who are writing code on the firm's computers to push their code into that internal fork, have an IP review. Again, this is an IP review. This is not a quality review. This is not a security review. This is just an IP review. And then have that reviewed code be pushed outside, right? So this is a mechanical recipe as how you can arrange your firewalls, your review system, and so on and so forth in such a way that pushing code outside the firm is actually a very standardized way of doing things. And there's no friction. You don't have to sit in front of a 5% panel to discuss what this code is doing, and et cetera, right? It's just mechanical. OK, so 3 steps to contribute. You train your people. That happens once. And in your training, make sure you go through the social, legal, and technical aspects of contributing to open source. You approve projects. That only happens once per project, right? So if 2 different people are going to contribute to the same project, they don't have to approve that project twice. And finally, you write code. And you make sure that the code portion of the workflow is as minimal as it can be. All right, ownership. Again, first things first, you sell the benefits. You make sure you have air support. You have to have people at the top level be behind you when you do this. To do ownership correctly, you make sure you have an approval process that's written down and everybody can follow the same thing. It shouldn't be bespoke. You make sure that you establish a proper outside presence. So for example, an organization on GitHub. And then establish guidelines for what it means to respond to issues and questions and bugs, right? That's really, really important from a community perspective. If you put a project out there and people, have an issue with it, and you don't respond to them, that really creates a very bad impression. So that's an important thing to establish and put up front. And finally, to really be open, you must have a contribution model. If you put code out there then that only your employees can edit, that's not really open. So here are some checkpoints for ownership. A community standard talks about things like what we find acceptable socially when we interact, on GitHub or any other forum, and it's really important. For example, we standardized on one of the standards that's out there that's used by 30,000 projects on GitHub. So if you can find something that's amenable to you, that's a good place to start. I can't emphasize this enough. You must make sure that your work is in the open, right? Don't create private workflows that other people can't see. That's not being open. Adopting a uniform license is a good way to put your organization on the map. It makes people understand that you've thought this stuff through, you know what you're doing, and the expectation is uniform across all the projects that you have. A contribution model will allow your users to finally come back and say, hey, I've been using this, it's great, but I need this bug fixed, or I need to have this thing enhanced. Can I do that myself? And that's a really big part of being open. Establish some code consistency rules, because that'll allow your project to actually have lower friction when it comes to things like code reviews. If somebody gives you a piece of code and you go tell them, well, this doesn't look right, that doesn't feel as good as saying, I looked at your piece of code and it's not consistent with this rule that's written down here. Please make sure it's the same. And finally, treat the community with respect. All right. In the next couple of minutes, I'm going to give you some questions you should ask yourself as to how open you are, right? After you've done all this stuff, what is going to be your answer to these questions determines how open you are with respect to your organization's participation in open source. So from a consumption perspective, ask yourself, how long does it take between deciding to use an open source product and the actual use, right? How long did it take between the developer said, I really would like to use this, and they started writing code that used that piece of code, right? How easy is it for somebody to evaluate a piece of open source software for use, right? This is pre-decision. You haven't made the decision to use it, but how easy is it to get your hands on that piece of software, feel it around and say, yay or nay, right? Sometimes that can be really difficult. How easy is it to keep things up to date? Do I have to go through fill 17 forms again to get a new version? Or is it just natural for me to get the next version without any friction? How many manual approvals does it take to use a piece of open source software? If you're contributing to open source, I just have a couple questions for you. How long does it take between having a patch and having it accepted? Right? I can tell you the figures went from months at Goldman Sachs before we had a program in place to days. How many manual approvals do you have to go from a patch to an acceptance? And this is my final slide. These are the questions you should ask yourself if you own a piece of open source software. Where is the ultimate source for this software? I've seen places where the source is actually kept in-house, and occasionally it's dumped outside. And that creates a really bad impression, for one thing, because it doesn't allow contribution. But that's a litmus test. Where do you keep the source? Are you discussing and making decisions out in public, or are you just emailing around your own firm and making choices that nobody else has any transparency on? How big and how wide is the community that's around the piece of open source you've put out there? That's actually one of the hardest things to get right. Building a community is very, very hard. What happens if you have a committer on a piece of open source software and they leave the company? Do they lose their rights because they left the company? Or do they retain them because they're an expert in what they're doing? And what's your average response time to an issue that's out in the open? Thank you for listening. In the next 4 minutes, we'd be happy to answer some questions. Yes?
What do you guys do for the identity that is used on GitHub for any contribution?
So the question was, what do we do for the identity that's used for contribution on GitHub? And the answer is, we allow you to use your own account, but we expect you to have the Goldman Sachs email on that account.
Do you do an org affiliation?
We do an org affiliation, but not publicly, not necessarily publicly. Yeah.
Go ahead. I mean, we've got about 4 minutes, so
Yep.
if there are a few other questions. Yeah. Oh, now I know why you're sitting here.
Hello? No. Do you guys have an incentive structure for contributing any open code? Any rules around that?
Certainly nothing formal, but it's the kind of thing where you do get visibility. And I would say the incentive structures are actually built into the system. This is one thing I tell people in our training, which is, why would you want to put yourself through this training, and why would you want to contribute to open source as an employee of a firm? And the answer is, sure, the copyright on that piece of code is Goldman Sachs, but you are the author. That becomes part of your digital resume, right? This is something you can point to and say, hey, I did this, right? So I think the incentives are actually built in.
Any other questions? We've got 2 minutes. We have two minutes left, so any other questions? From Mo? No? No? Hearing none? No? Bueller again? Oh, yeah. Okay, here we go.
Once a package that you released is out there and lives its own life, right? And it goes forward and maybe ups the version. And how do you keep consistency between what you actually implemented in your production systems and what's going on, the package living in its own life in the open source community? The APIs change, the compatibilities change, so that impedance has to be closed somehow.
So keeping up to date with versions is a difficult problem for everybody, right? And I don't think the answer changes at all if you own that piece of software or not. You have to balance the cost of being on a new version versus potential problems that you have on old stuff. Most importantly, security, right? So that's the kind of thing we look at. Is it important we do this because of security, for example, or is it commercial not to do it because we've got other things to do?
Okay. Any other questions? You have a minute left. Sorry to be so granular. Yes, ma'am. 1 minute, 30 seconds left. 45 seconds, or 47.
In the open source environment, how do you ensure the functional testing coverage is high?
The what?
Functional testing.
Functional testing. For a piece of software that we own as open source, we have a set of rules that say, you have to have tests with this software and so on and so forth, which means at the point where somebody is doing a pull request, if that particular new functionality or bug fix or whatever doesn't have the required tests, we ask them to write those tests before we merge the pull request in.
So in your slides earlier, you showed the contribution process that someone from the firm has to go to contribute code out to GitHub or bring it in. In a perfect world, what does that look like, and how long does it take you to get to that perfect world?
In what, sir?
In a perfect world where the process can be exactly what you want it to be, not what security wants it to be.
So the one thing that's essentially time consuming is the review, right? And I would say the typical time frame for a small patch or whatever is about a day, right? It's just somebody has to look at it, and so It's much, much faster than it used to be, which was literally weeks, if not months. How much of that can be automated? The IP review, that's actually kind of hard because, you know, we have people who look at things like, did you accidentally put somebody's password in there? Did you have some personally identifiable information in there? That sort of stuff. That's actually very hard to automate. If you have any ideas on how to do that, it'd be great. But I haven't seen any software or any attempt at doing that.